On Christmas morning, my mother-in-law handed me divorce papers in front of the entire family, smiling as if she had just given me a gift, and no one said a word, not even my husband, and in that moment, I realized this had been planned long before I ever sat down at that table. What hurt the most wasn't the papers. It was the silence, the way everyone watched me like they were waiting for me to fall apart, but they didn't know what I already knew, and they definitely didn't know what I had in my bag. What happened next changed everything. And if you've ever been in a room where everyone turned against you, then just take a second to subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Only if this story truly resonates with you, because stories like this, they don't happen in isolation. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this was the morning my entire marriage and everything I thought I knew about my family shattered in front of me. But the truth is, it didn't start on Christmas. It started weeks earlier, in small moments that didn't seem important at the time. Moments I almost ignored, like the night Daniel came home late and didn't say where he had been, or the way his phone would light up and he would turn it face down immediately. I told myself I was overthinking, that stress from work was getting to him, that marriage goes through phases, but something felt off, not loud, not obvious, just wrong, like a quiet shift in the room you can't explain. Then there was Margaret, my mother-in-law. She had never really liked me, but she had always been subtle about it. Polite smiles, careful words, just enough distance to make me feel like I didn't belong. But about 3 weeks before Christmas, something changed. She stopped pretending. Her comments became sharper, more direct. One night at dinner, she looked at me and said, "Daniel needs someone who understands his world." And then she paused, just long enough for it to land, before adding, "Someone who can actually contribute." I didn't respond. I just nodded slightly and kept eating, but my hands felt cold under the table. And Daniel didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He just kept eating like nothing had happened. And that was the first time I felt it. Not anger, not even sadness. Just a quiet realization that I was standing alone in a room full of people who were supposed to be my family. After that, things started adding up. Small things, almost invisible. Daniel taking calls in another room. Margaret visiting more often without telling me. Conversations stopping the second I walked in. I tried to ignore it, I really did. Because admitting something is wrong means you have to be ready for what comes next. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. But then one afternoon, I found something I wasn't supposed to see. Daniel had left a folder on the kitchen counter, just slightly open, like he thought no one would notice. I wasn't trying to snoop. I just saw my name, and something in me paused. I stood there for a second, just looking at it, my heart beating a little faster, and then I opened it, slowly. Inside were documents, legal documents, my name, his name, and one word that made everything go quiet in my head: divorce. I didn't react right away. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just stood there, reading the same line over and over again, like if I read it enough times it would change. But it didn't. It was real. Signed, prepared, dated, and what hurt more than anything was the date. It wasn't recent. It had been prepared over a week ago, which meant every dinner, every conversation, every quiet moment we had shared since then had been a lie. I closed the folder carefully and put it back exactly where I found it, my hands steady, even though my chest felt tight, and that's when something shifted inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet decision. If they were planning something behind my back, then I wasn't going to walk into it unprepared. I didn't confront him. I didn't say a word. Instead, I started paying attention, really paying attention. I watched how Daniel moved, how he spoke. When he avoided eye contact, I listened to the way Margaret spoke about the future, about what's best for the family. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand what they were planning. But more importantly, I started preparing my own response. Because if they thought I was going to sit there and sign whatever they put in front of me, they were about to learn how wrong they were, and what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already taken the first step long before Christmas morning ever arrived. I did not confront Daniel that night. I did not ask him why. I did not even let my voice change. Because the moment I saw those papers, I understood something very clearly. This was not a sudden decision. This was something they had planned carefully, quietly, and I was the only one who was not supposed to know. So instead of reacting, I watched. The next morning, I made coffee like usual. I asked him how he slept. I smiled when he answered, and I noticed how easily he lied, how naturally he avoided my eyes, like he had already convinced himself that what he was doing was justified, and that was the moment I stopped seeing him as my husband and started seeing him as someone I needed to understand. Not emotionally, but strategically, because if I wanted to survive what was coming, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. Over the next few days, I paid attention to everything. The way his phone never left his hand, the way he stepped outside to take calls even when it was cold enough to see your breath in the air, the way Margaret started showing up more often, always with a reason that sounded harmless but never quite felt right. One afternoon, I heard them talking in the living room, their voices low, almost careful. I was in the hallway, just out of sight, and I froze when I heard my name. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I just listened. Margaret said, "Christmas morning will be best. Everyone will be there. It will be clean, no drama." And Daniel hesitated for a second before replying, "She will sign. She does not have a choice." And there it was, simple, direct, final. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not even fear, just a quiet clarity. They had already decided the outcome. They had already written the ending. And in their version of the story, I was the one who lost everything. I stepped back slowly, careful not to let the floor creak, and walked into the kitchen like nothing had happened, my hands steady as I picked up a glass of water, but inside, something had shifted completely, because now I was not guessing anymore. I knew, and knowing changes everything. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I sat in the living room with the lights off, just staring at nothing, replaying every word I had heard, every detail, every assumption they had made about me, and one thought kept repeating in my mind. They think I am powerless. They think I have no leverage, no options, no way out. And that was their biggest mistake, because what they did not know, what they never bothered to understand, was that for the past 2 years, I had been quietly building something of my own, something separate from Daniel, something he had never paid attention to because he was too busy listening to his mother. I had invested money my father left me, not a lot, but enough to start. I had put it into a small consulting project, then another, then another. And slowly, without making a big deal out of it, it had grown, not into something flashy, not into something obvious, but into something real, something stable, something that was mine, and more importantly, something that was legally protected in ways Daniel had clearly never considered. I stood up and walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up every document, every agreement, every account tied to my name. I read through them carefully, not because I did not trust them, but because I needed to see the full picture. I needed to know exactly what I had and what I could use, because this was no longer about saving a marriage. This was about protecting myself from people who had already decided to remove me from their lives, like I was something disposable. The next morning, I made a call, not to a friend, not to family, but to a lawyer, someone I had worked with briefly before, someone who understood business and contracts. I kept my voice calm as I explained the situation, leaving out the emotions, focusing only on the facts. And when I mentioned the divorce papers, there was a short pause on the other end before he said, "If they have already prepared documents, then you need to be ready before they present them." I nodded, even though he could not see me, because that was exactly what I had already decided. Over the next week, I worked quietly, carefully, gathering everything I needed, organizing documents, reviewing ownership structures, making sure every detail was clear, every position secured. I did not rush. I did not panic. I moved step by step, like someone solving a problem, not someone reacting to a crisis, and all the while, I played my role perfectly. I smiled at dinner. I helped decorate the house for Christmas. I wrapped gifts. I laughed when expected, and I watched them relax. I watched Daniel become more confident, more distant, like he was already imagining a life without me, and Margaret, she seemed almost pleased, like she was finally getting what she wanted, and the closer we got to Christmas morning, the more certain they became that everything was under control, that I would sit there, open that envelope, and do exactly what they expected. And maybe a part of them even felt generous, like they were giving me a clean exit, a quiet ending. But what they did not realize, what they could not see, was that I had already written a different ending, one they would not understand until it was too late. And by the time Christmas morning arrived, the envelope in my bag was no longer just preparation. It was the moment everything would change. Christmas morning arrived quietly, almost too quietly, like the house itself was holding its breath. The tree lights were still glowing softly in the corner, gifts arranged perfectly underneath, the smell of cinnamon and coffee lingering in the air. And for a moment, everything looked exactly the way it should, like a picture of a perfect family. But I knew better. I had known for days. I woke up early, before anyone else, and sat at the edge of the bed for a few seconds, just letting the silence settle, my heart steady, my thoughts clear. I was not nervous, not anymore. I had already moved past that. This was not about fear. This was about timing. I stood up, got dressed slowly, choosing something simple, nothing that would draw attention, because today was not about how I looked. It was about what I was about to do. I picked up my bag and checked it one more time. The envelope was still there, sealed, untouched, exactly where it needed to be. I ran my fingers over it briefly, then closed the bag and walked out of the room. When I entered the kitchen, Margaret was already there, standing by the counter, pouring herself coffee. She glanced at me, her expression calm, almost pleasant. "Merry Christmas," she said, her voice light, like nothing unusual was about to happen. I returned the greeting just as calmly, watching her for a second, noticing how relaxed she seemed, how certain, like someone who believed everything was already decided. Daniel came in a few minutes later, his steps slow, his eyes avoiding mine for just a fraction of a second before he forced a small smile. "Morning?" he said, and I nodded. Nothing more. Nothing less. We moved through the motions of the morning like actors following a script, setting the table, arranging plates, making sure everything looked right, and slowly, one by one, the rest of the family arrived. His father, his sister, a couple of relatives. Voices filled the house. Laughter, conversation, the sound of wrapping paper being handled, chairs being pulled out, and I could feel it, that underlying tension, not obvious, not loud, but present, like a thin layer beneath everything, like everyone was waiting for something without saying it out loud. We all sat down around the table, the same table where we had shared countless meals, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. People talking, passing dishes, commenting on the decorations. But then I noticed it, the way Margaret kept glancing at Daniel, the way he would give a small nod, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And I had been looking for days. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands steady, listening, observing, not rushing anything, because I knew it was coming. And then it happened. Margaret reached for something beside her plate, a simple envelope, plain, unmarked, and she placed it gently on the table in front of me, the movement slow, deliberate, like she wanted everyone to see it. The conversation around the table faded almost instantly. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the silence to grow. She looked at me, her expression calm, controlled. "You should open it," she said, her voice carrying just enough to make sure everyone heard. I looked at the envelope, then at her, then at Daniel, who was staring down at his plate, not saying a word, and in that moment, everything became very clear, not because of what was happening, but because of how carefully it had been arranged. Every detail, every person present, every second timed, they had chosen this moment, this setting, because they believed it would leave me with no choice, no space to react, no way to push back. I reached forward slowly and picked up the envelope, my fingers steady, no hesitation, no visible reaction, and I could feel it, the weight of their expectations, the way the room leaned toward me, waiting, watching, expecting something. Tears, anger, confusion, anything that would confirm their version of me, but I gave them nothing. I opened the envelope carefully, pulling out the papers, my eyes moving across the page. Even though I already knew what it said, divorce documents, prepared, finalized, waiting for my signature, I let a few seconds pass, not too long, just enough, then I placed the papers back on the table, flat, controlled, and for a moment, no one spoke. Margaret leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged. "It is better this way," she said, as if she was explaining something reasonable, something necessary. I turned my head and looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and asked quietly, "Is this what you want?" He hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice low, and that single word echoed louder than anything else in the room. I held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, slowly, like I was accepting it, like I was agreeing, and I could feel the shift, the subtle release of tension around the table, the way shoulders relaxed, the way people started breathing normally again, because in their minds, it was over, the outcome confirmed, the problem solved, but they did not understand what that nod actually meant. I reached down and picked up my bag, placing it gently on my lap, my movements calm, unhurried. I opened it and took out my own envelope, placing it on the table in front of Margaret, right next to the papers she had given me, and for the first time, something changed in her expression, just a flicker, a brief moment of uncertainty. I looked at her and said, just as calmly as she had spoken to me, "Then you should read this first," and the room went completely silent. Margaret did not touch the envelope right away, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as if she was deciding whether it was even worth acknowledging. But I could see it, that small hesitation, that brief crack in her certainty, and Daniel noticed it too, his eyes flickering between the two envelopes, one he believed controlled the situation and the one he did not understand. The silence stretched longer this time, heavier, more uncomfortable, because now they were no longer sure what they were waiting for. I did not rush them. I did not repeat myself. I simply sat there, calm, steady, letting the weight of that moment settle over the room, because this time, the attention was not on me reacting. It was on them realizing something was different. Finally, Margaret reached forward and picked up my envelope, her movements slower than before, less certain. She opened it carefully, not dramatically, just enough to slide the documents out, and for a second, nothing changed. Her expression remained controlled, composed, but then her eyes moved, scanning the first page, then the second, and I saw it the exact moment it hit her. Her posture stiffened slightly, her lips pressed together, and she stopped reading. Daniel leaned closer, his voice low. "What is it?" he asked. But she did not answer immediately. She just kept looking at the page like she was trying to process something that did not match what she expected, and that was when the shift truly began. I watched Daniel take the papers from her hands, his movements quicker, more impatient, like he needed to reassert control over something he no longer understood. He read the first line, then the next, and his expression changed in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, something closer to realization, the kind that comes too late. "What is this?" he asked, his voice no longer steady, and I met his eyes calmly. "It is everything you did not think to check," I said, my tone even, not raised, not sharp, just clear. He looked back down at the documents, flipping through them now, faster, scanning, searching for something to disprove it. But there was nothing to disprove. Every page was real, every signature valid, every clause exactly where it needed to be. Margaret stood up slightly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "This does not make sense," she said, but her voice no longer carried the same authority. It was thinner, uncertain, and for the first time that morning, people around the table began to move, shifting in their seats, glancing at each other, whispering quietly, because now they were no longer watching me, they were watching them. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and let them read, let them understand, because this was not something that needed explanation. It was something that needed time to sink in. Daniel stopped flipping pages and looked up at me, his eyes searching. "You transferred everything," he said slowly, like he was still trying to piece it together, and I nodded once. "Not everything," I replied, "just what matters." And that distinction seemed to land harder than anything else, because what he was holding in his hands was not just a response, it was a complete reversal of the position he thought he was in. The business accounts he assumed were shared, the investments he believed were tied to him, the assets he thought would be divided, they were not. They had never been. They were structured, protected, and entirely outside his reach. And more importantly, the agreement attached to those documents made one thing very clear. If he proceeded with the divorce under the terms he had already signed, he would walk away with far less than he expected. Margaret took a step closer, her eyes moving quickly over the pages again, like she was looking for a mistake, something she could challenge. But there was nothing there for her to challenge, because unlike their plan, mine had not been rushed, it had not been built on assumptions, it had been prepared carefully, legally, and completely. "You knew," she said, her voice lower now, almost sharp, and I looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with quiet clarity. "I found out," I corrected, because that was the truth. I had not started this. I had simply chosen not to be blindsided by it. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when he was overwhelmed. And for a moment, he looked like he was trying to go back, like he was searching for a version of this situation where he still had control, but that version no longer existed. The room felt different now, not tense in the same way as before, but unsettled, and like the ground had shifted and no one was quite sure where to stand. I reached forward and gently pushed the original divorce papers back toward him, the same ones they had placed in front of me, and said quietly, "If you still want to go through with this, you can." And I meant it. There was no threat in my voice, no challenge, just a statement, because at this point, the decision was no longer one-sided. It was no longer something they controlled, and that realization was far more powerful than anything I could have said. Daniel looked down at the papers, then back at me, and for the first time since that morning began, he hesitated, not for a second, but long enough for everyone in the room to notice, and in that hesitation, everything they had planned began to unravel, not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, in the way that truly changes things, because now, they were the ones who did not know what would happen next. No one spoke for a few seconds after Daniel hesitated, and that silence felt completely different from the one earlier. This was not the silence of people waiting for someone to break. This was the silence of people realizing something had gone wrong, something they did not anticipate. Daniel looked down at the papers again, slower this time, like he was hoping he had misunderstood, like if he read it carefully enough it would somehow change, but it did not. And I could see it in the way his shoulders tightened slightly, in the way his breathing became more measured, controlled, like he was trying to regain something that had already slipped out of his hands. Margaret stepped closer to him, her voice low but firm. "Daniel, this changes nothing," she said, but even as she said it, there was a hesitation in her tone, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. He did not respond immediately, and that alone was enough to shift the entire dynamic in the room, because Daniel was never the one who hesitated. He was always decisive, always certain, especially when his mother was involved. But now, he stood there, caught between what he had planned and what he was just beginning to understand. I watched him carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet distance, because in that moment, I was no longer emotionally inside the situation. I was observing it, like someone watching a structure collapse that had been unstable for a long time. "You said she would not have anything," Margaret continued, her voice sharper now, directed at him, not at me. And that was the first time her control cracked openly. Daniel exhaled slowly, running his hand through his hair again. "I thought she did not," he admitted, and those words, simple as they were, carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because they revealed the assumption everything had been built on, that I was dependent, that I had nothing separate, nothing protected, nothing of my own, and that assumption had been their foundation. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, and spoke calmly. "You never asked," I said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact. And that seemed to land harder than if I had raised my voice, because it exposed something deeper than betrayal. It exposed indifference, the kind that comes from never truly seeing the person sitting across from you. Margaret turned toward me, her expression tightening. "This is not how things work," she said, as if the structure she believed in could still override reality. "You are part of this family. Everything should have been shared." I held her gaze steady. "It was shared," I replied, "just not in the way you assumed." And again, I kept my tone even, because this was not about winning an argument. It was about letting the truth settle, one piece at a time. Around the table, people shifted again, some looking down, others glancing between Margaret and Daniel, unsure of where to align themselves now that the situation had changed. His father cleared his throat softly, like he wanted to say something but chose not to, and his sister, who had been quietly watching the entire time, leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable, but no longer dismissive, because now, I was no longer the predictable figure they had all placed in the background. I was something else, something they had not accounted for. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower, less certain. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, and for a moment, I considered the question, not because I owed him an explanation, but because it revealed how he still saw the situation, as if my silence had been the problem, as if the responsibility to fix this had always been mine. "Because you already made your decision," I answered, and that was the truth. He had already signed the papers, already planned the moment, already decided the outcome without including me. So there had been nothing to discuss, only something to prepare for. Margaret shook her head slightly, like she was rejecting the entire situation. "This does not change the fact that this marriage is over," she said, trying to reestablish control through certainty, and I nodded once. "I agree," I replied, and that seemed to catch her off guard, because she had expected resistance, emotion, something she could push against, but I gave her none of that. I was not fighting the divorce, I was simply refusing to be erased by it, and that distinction changed everything. Daniel looked at me again, searching for something, maybe regret, maybe anger, maybe anything that would make this feel more familiar, but all he found was calm, and that unsettled him more than anything else. I reached for my cup of coffee, now lukewarm, and took a small sip, setting it back down carefully, the normalcy of the action almost out of place in the middle of everything that was happening. But that was the point. I was not reacting to them anymore. I was moving on from them, in real time, right in front of them. Margaret crossed her arms, her posture more rigid now, defensive. "Then sign the papers," she said, pushing the documents slightly toward me again, as if trying to force the moment back into her control. I looked at the papers, then back at her, and shook my head gently. "Not those," I said, my voice still calm, and that single sentence shifted the tension once more, because now, it was clear. I was not refusing the divorce. I was refusing the terms, and that was something they had not prepared for. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion mixing with the realization already forming. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I met his gaze steadily. "If this is going to happen, it will happen correctly," I said. And as those words settled into the room, the balance of power, which had already begun to tilt, shifted just a little further in my direction, because for the first time since this started, I was not just responding, I was setting the terms. I could see it in Daniel's face, the moment he realized he was no longer in control of how this would end, not because I had raised my voice or forced anything, but because I had taken away the one thing he and his mother relied on, certainty. He looked down at the papers again, then back at me, slower this time, like he was recalculating everything he thought he understood. "What does correctly mean?" he asked, and his voice was quieter now, more careful, as if the wrong tone might make things worse. I held his gaze for a second before answering, not rushing, not pushing, just letting the words land the way they needed to. "It means you do not get to decide everything in advance and expect me to just follow along," I said. And the room felt that, not as a confrontation, but as a shift in structure, because for the first time, I was not reacting to what they had set up. I was redefining the terms entirely. Margaret let out a short breath, almost a quiet scoff, but it lacked the confidence she had earlier. "This is unnecessary," she said, trying to dismiss what she did not fully understand. But I did not look at her. I kept my focus on Daniel, because this was no longer about her control. It was about his choice, and whether he even understood the position he was in now. "If you still want the divorce, then we do it through proper review," I continued, my tone even, with full disclosure, all assets, all agreements, everything on the table, and I paused briefly, just enough for the weight of that to settle. "Not just what you assumed I did not have." That last part stayed in the air longer than anything else, because it directly challenged the foundation of everything they had planned. Daniel swallowed, a small movement, but noticeable, and glanced down at the documents in his hands again, as if seeing them differently now, not as a solution, but as something incomplete, something flawed. "This will complicate things," he said, and I nodded once. "It should," I replied, And that answer shifted something again, because I was not trying to make this easier. I was making it accurate. And accuracy does not always feel comfortable, especially when it exposes what was overlooked. Margaret stepped closer, her presence sharper now. "Daniel, this is exactly what she wants," she said, her voice controlled but edged with urgency. "She is trying to delay this, to make it messy." And for the first time, I turned my head slightly toward her, not fully, just enough. "No," I said calmly, "I am making sure it is not one-sided." And the distinction mattered, because delay implies avoidance, but what I was doing was forcing balance. And balance is something they had not planned for. Around the table, the energy continued to shift. The quiet conversations that had been whispers earlier now stopped entirely, because now everyone understood this was not just a moment, it was a turning point. Daniel looked between me and his mother, caught between two versions of the situation, one he had prepared for and one he did not recognize. And I could see the hesitation growing, not because he did not want the divorce anymore, but because he no longer knew what it would cost him. "You should have told me," he said again, softer this time, almost like he was searching for something to hold on to, and I shook my head slightly. "You should have asked," I repeated, and there was no anger in it, just a quiet truth that he could not argue with, because the absence of that question was exactly what had led us here. Margaret's posture tightened further, her arms crossing more firmly now, a defensive barrier forming where control used to be. "We are not going to drag this out," she said, her voice firm again, trying to reclaim authority through decisiveness. And I nodded, not disagreeing, but not conceding either. "Then we should not," I said, "which is why everything needs to be clear from the beginning." And that was the point they were struggling with. Clarity removes advantage when that advantage is built on assumption. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly, not in defeat, but in the kind of realization that comes when the path forward is no longer simple. He looked down at the divorce papers again, then at the documents I had provided, and for the first time, he did not immediately know which one mattered more. That uncertainty, small as it seemed, was everything, because it meant the outcome was no longer predetermined. I leaned back slightly, giving him space, not pushing him toward any decision, because at this point, I did not need to. The structure of the situation had already changed. Margaret opened her mouth to speak again, but this time, Daniel raised his hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to stop her, and that alone shifted the room more than anything else that had been said, because it was the first time he had interrupted her, the first time he had not followed her lead, and in that small gesture, the dynamic between them shifted, subtle but real. He looked at me again, more directly now. "What are you proposing?" he asked, and there it was, the question that should have been asked from the beginning, the one that acknowledged I was no longer just reacting, I was participating. I met his gaze, steady, calm. "We review everything properly, with attorneys, with full transparency," I said, "and then we decide what happens next." And I let that settle, not adding anything more because I did not need to. The simplicity of it was enough. Margaret shook her head slightly, but did not interrupt this time, because now, even she could feel it. The shift was no longer something she could control. Daniel looked down one more time at the papers in his hands, then slowly placed them back on the table, not pushing them toward me, not holding on to them, just setting them down. And that small action spoke louder than anything else in the room, because it meant one thing very clearly. The plan they had walked into that morning with was no longer the plan they were leaving with, and for the first time since this began, the next move was not theirs to dictate. It was something we would decide together, whether they liked it or not. Daniel's hand remained on the table for a moment after he set the papers down, like he was not quite ready to let go of them completely, and that hesitation carried through the entire room, because everyone could feel it. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible now. Something had broken in the structure they had walked in with. Margaret noticed it immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly, her posture tightening as she turned toward him. "Daniel," she said, her tone controlled but sharper than before. "This is not complicated. You already made your decision." And the way she said it made it clear she was not just reminding him, she was trying to pull him back into alignment with the plan. But Daniel did not respond right away, and that silence, small as it was, felt louder than anything else that had happened so far. I watched him carefully, not expecting him to change, not hoping for anything, just observing, because at this point, I was no longer trying to influence his choice. I was simply allowing the reality of the situation to settle around him. He looked down at the documents again, then at me, then back at his mother, and I could see it, the conflict, not emotional, but structural, like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same situation that no longer fit together. "It is complicated," he said finally, his voice lower, more measured, and that single sentence shifted the balance again because it was the first time he openly disagreed with her, not aggressively, not dramatically, but clearly, and Margaret reacted immediately. "No, it is not," she replied, stepping closer to him, her voice firm. "You are letting this become something it does not need to be." But the certainty she had earlier was no longer as strong. It was thinner now, more strained, and that difference mattered. Because control relies on certainty, and certainty had already begun to erode. I stayed quiet, letting them speak, letting the tension build between them, because this was not something I needed to interrupt. It was something that needed to happen on its own. Daniel ran his hand along the edge of the table, a small, almost unconscious movement, and then he looked at me again, more directly this time. "You have already spoken to a lawyer," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and I nodded once. "Yes," I answered simply, and that answer seemed to settle something for him, not resolve it, but clarify it, because now he understood this was not a reaction, it was preparation. Margaret let out a short breath, shaking her head slightly. "Of course she has," she said, but this time there was no dismissiveness in her tone, only frustration, because the situation had moved beyond her expectations, beyond her control. The rest of the family remained quiet, watching, but no longer with the same confidence they had earlier, their expressions more cautious now, or more aware that what they were witnessing was not going according to plan. Daniel leaned back slightly, creating a small distance between himself and the table, between himself and the documents, and that physical shift reflected something deeper. He was stepping out of the position he had been in, even if he had not fully decided what came next. "If we do this your way," he said slowly, looking at me, "then everything gets reviewed," and I nodded again. "Everything," I confirmed, and the word carried weight, because it did not just refer to assets, it referred to assumptions, to everything they believed they understood about me. Margaret's expression tightened further. "This is exactly why this should not be delayed," she said, her voice rising just slightly, not enough to be loud, but enough to reveal the pressure underneath. "The longer this goes on, the more unnecessary complications there will be," and I finally turned my head fully toward her, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since this began. "It is only complicated if you were relying on things staying hidden," I said calmly. And that line landed harder than anything else I had said so far, because it did not accuse, it revealed, and for a moment, Margaret had no immediate response, which in itself was a response. Daniel looked between us again, but this time, his focus lingered on me a second longer, like he was seeing something he had not seen before. Not just the documents, not just the situation, but me. And that realization came with its own weight, because it meant he was beginning to understand how much he had overlooked. "What else do I not know?" he asked quietly. And that question, more than any statement, showed how far things had shifted, because now he was no longer assuming, he was asking. I held his gaze for a moment, then answered honestly, "That depends on how much you are willing to actually look at." And I did not elaborate, because I did not need to. The point was not to overwhelm him with information. It was to make it clear that the version of reality he had been operating on was incomplete. Margaret stepped back slightly, her arms still crossed, but her posture no longer as firm, more rigid now, more defensive. And for the first time, she looked around the table, as if realizing the room itself had shifted, that the audience she had counted on was no longer aligned the way she expected. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough to show the tension he had been holding, and then he did something small, almost unnoticeable, but significant. He reached forward and moved the divorce papers slightly away from me, not toward himself, not toward his mother, just away, creating space between them and the center of the table, and that single movement changed the visual balance of the entire scene. because it removed the focus from the outcome they had planned and placed it somewhere undefined, somewhere open. I watched that movement without reacting, without commenting, because it spoke for itself, and in that moment, the room felt different again, quieter, not with tension, but with uncertainty, because now no one knew what would happen next, not even them, and for the first time since this began, that uncertainty did not belong to me, it belonged to them. The silence did not break right away. It stretched across the table in a way that felt unfamiliar, not sharp like before, not tense with expectation, but heavy with something else, something slower, like the room itself was trying to catch up with what had just happened. Daniel's hand lingered near the edge of the table, his fingers resting close to the papers he had just moved aside, and for a moment, he did not look at anyone, not at me, not at his mother, just at the space in front of him, like he was trying to see something that was not there before. Margaret noticed it too. Of course she did. Her gaze fixed on him now instead of me, her focus shifting because I was no longer the center of the problem. He was, "Daniel," she said again, softer this time, but more controlled, more deliberate. "You are overthinking this." And that word, overthinking, hung in the air like an attempt to simplify something that had already grown too complex to ignore. But Daniel did not respond immediately, and that hesitation was no longer small. It was visible. It was something everyone at the table could see. His father shifted slightly in his chair, clearing his throat again, not loudly, just enough to break the stillness for a second. But even that sound seemed out of place now, like normal reactions did not quite fit the moment anymore. I remained still, my posture relaxed, my hands resting calmly in front of me, because this was not a moment I needed to control. It was a moment that needed to unfold. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes moving slowly from his mother to me. And there was something different there now. Not confusion, not even doubt, but awareness. The kind that comes when you realize a situation is bigger than what you assumed. "What happens if we do not follow your process?" he asked, his voice steady but quieter than before. And the question itself changed the room again, because it was no longer about denying what I had presented. It was about understanding the consequences of ignoring it. I met his gaze evenly, not rushing to answer, letting the weight of the question settle before I spoke. "Then you proceed with incomplete information," I said calmly, "and you accept whatever that leads to." And I did not raise my voice. I did not emphasize the words. I simply let them exist as they were, clear and direct. Margaret shook her head immediately, her reaction faster now, more instinctive. "That is not how this works," she said, but her tone lacked the certainty it had earlier, and that difference was impossible to ignore. Daniel did not look at her this time. He kept his eyes on me, processing, calculating, and for the first time, I could see him stepping outside of her influence, even if only slightly, even if only for a moment. "And your process guarantees what?" he asked, and I answered without hesitation. "Clarity," I said, "nothing more, nothing less." And that answer landed differently than anything else I had said so far, because it did not promise advantage, it did not threaten loss, it simply offered something they had not planned for: transparency. And transparency is uncomfortable when you are used to operating without it. The room shifted again, quieter now, more focused, because everyone could feel that this was no longer about emotion, it was about structure, about what would actually happen next. Margaret's arms remained crossed, but her posture had changed, less rigid, more guarded, like she was reassessing rather than asserting, and that shift was subtle, but it mattered, because it meant she was no longer dictating the direction of the conversation. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as he leaned back in his chair, creating distance not just physically, but mentally, from the position he had held earlier. "So we stop here," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, and then looked at me again. "And we revisit everything." And I nodded once, not pushing, not confirming beyond that, because the decision needed to feel like his, not something I forced. Margaret turned toward him quickly, her voice sharper again. "Daniel, this is exactly what she wants," she said. But there was something different now, not just urgency, but concern, because she could see the shift happening and she did not know how to stop it. He looked at her this time, but only briefly, before returning his focus to the table, to the space between the two sets of documents, and that space had become the center of everything. the place where the outcome was no longer fixed, where control had dissolved into possibility. "Maybe that is not a bad thing," he said quietly. And those words, simple as they were, changed everything, because they acknowledged something Margaret had not expected, that what I wanted was not something to resist, but something to consider. The room went still again, but this time, it was not heavy, it was open, uncertain in a way that allowed movement instead of restricting it. I watched Margaret closely, the way her jaw tightened slightly, the way her eyes shifted, calculating, adjusting, and for the first time, she did not immediately respond, because she could feel it too. The dynamic had changed in a way she could not easily reverse. Daniel leaned forward again, not toward the divorce papers, not toward his mother, but toward the center of the table, toward the space where everything was now being decided, and he placed both hands flat against the surface, steady, grounded. "We will do it your way," he said finally. And the words did not come with hesitation this time. They came with a quiet certainty that felt different from before, not imposed, not influenced, but chosen. And in that moment, the last piece of their original plan fell away completely, because the outcome they had prepared for no longer existed, and what replaced it was something they had never considered, something they could not control, something that now belonged equally to both of us. And as the room settled into that new reality, I realized something that had not been clear before. This was no longer just about protecting myself. It was about redefining everything they thought they could take from me. And that shift, quiet as it was the moment everything truly changed. No one reacted immediately after Daniel said those words, and that stillness felt different from everything that had come before. It was not tense, not heavy. It was uncertain in a way that left space for something new, something no one at that table had planned for. Margaret's eyes stayed on him, searching, as if she was waiting for him to correct himself, to take it back, but he did not. He kept his hands flat on the table, steady, grounded, and for the first time that morning, he was not looking to her for direction. He was looking forward, thinking for himself. And that shift, quiet as it was, changed everything. I did not respond right away. I did not acknowledge it with anything more than a small nod, because this moment was not about me confirming anything. It was about letting the decision settle fully into the room, letting everyone understand what had just happened. His father leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling under his breath, like he had been holding tension he did not realize was there. His sister glanced at Margaret briefly, then looked away, her posture relaxing just a fraction, because the certainty that had defined the morning was gone, replaced by something more unpredictable. Margaret finally spoke again, but her voice was different now, less sharp, more controlled, almost measured. "We will discuss this later," she said, as if trying to contain the situation, to move it out of the public space where it had started to unravel. But Daniel shook his head slightly, not forcefully, just enough to interrupt the direction she was trying to set. "No," he said quietly, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because it was not loud, it was not confrontational, but it was final. He turned his head toward her, meeting her gaze directly. "We are not postponing this," he added, and there was something steady in his tone now, something that had not been there earlier, not confidence in the outcome, but clarity in the process. Margaret's lips pressed together, her posture tightening again, but this time, it was not control. It was resistance. And resistance is not the same thing. Resistance reacts, control directs, and she was no longer directing anything in that moment. I remained still, watching, because this part did not belong to me. It was unfolding between them, a shift in dynamic that had been building long before this morning, but had never been forced into the open until now. Daniel reached forward and picked up my documents again, not quickly, not aggressively, just with intention, and he began reading them more carefully this time, not scanning, not searching for flaws, but actually reading, understanding, processing, and that difference mattered, because it meant he was no longer looking for a way to dismiss them. He was trying to understand what they meant for him, for us, for everything he thought he knew about this situation. "You structured all of this without telling me," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less defensive, more reflective, and I answered simply, "I did not hide it, because that was the truth. Nothing I had done was concealed. It had simply never been important enough for him to notice, and that realization seemed to land slowly, like something settling into place rather than hitting all at once. He nodded slightly, almost to himself, then looked back down at the pages, continuing to read. Margaret took a step back, her arms still crossed, but her stance shifting as she looked around the table, as if reassessing not just the situation, but the people in it. The audience she had counted on to reinforce her position was no longer aligned, and she could feel it. Even if no one said it out loud. His father leaned forward slightly, placing his hands together, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive now, and for the first time he spoke, his voice calm, measured. "It sounds like there is more here than we assumed," and that acknowledgement, simple as it was, shifted the tone of the room again, because it introduced something that had been missing earlier: perspective, not judgment, not pressure, just recognition. Daniel nodded again, more firmly this time, and set the documents down carefully, not discarding them, not pushing them away, just placing them in front of him like something that needed to be considered fully. "There is," he said quietly. And then he looked at me, really looked this time, not as someone reacting to a situation, but as someone trying to understand the person sitting across from him. "And I did not see it," he added, and those words were not an apology, but they carried the weight of one, because they acknowledged something deeper than the situation itself. They acknowledged the gap that had existed between us, the assumptions, the distance, the lack of attention, and that acknowledgement, quiet as it was, mattered more than anything else he could have said in that moment. I held his gaze for a second, then nodded once, not to accept anything, not to resolve anything, just to recognize that the truth had finally been spoken out loud. Margaret shifted her weight slightly, her expression tightening again, but this time she did not interrupt, she did not push, she did not try to redirect the conversation, because she could see that it was no longer hers to control. Daniel leaned back in his chair again, his posture more relaxed now, but not careless, just grounded, like he had stepped into a different position entirely. "We will review everything," he said more clearly now, not as a suggestion, not as a negotiation, but as a decision. And the way he said it left no room for immediate challenge, because it was not driven by emotion, it was driven by understanding, and that difference made it harder to argue against. The room settled into that new reality slowly, not with a dramatic shift, but with a quiet acceptance, the kind that comes when people realize the direction has changed, and there is no simple way to return to what they expected. I reached for my bag and closed it gently, my movements calm, deliberate, because I did not need to do anything else in that moment. The shift had already happened, the balance had already changed, and as I sat there, looking around the table, I realized something that felt both simple and profound at the same time. This was not the end of anything, not the end of the marriage, not the end of the conflict. It was the end of the version of me they thought they could control. And whatever came next, whatever decisions were made after this, they would not be made in a room where I was silent. They would be made in a space where I was fully seen, fully aware, and no longer underestimated. No one reached for the food anymore. The plates sat untouched in front of us. The coffee had gone cold, and the room that had started the morning with laughter and soft conversation now felt like a completely different place, not because of what was said, but because of what had shifted underneath everything. Daniel stayed where he was, his attention no longer moving between people, no longer reacting to Margaret's presence, but focused, steady, like he had stepped into a different role entirely, and that alone made the room feel unfamiliar. His father leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, watching quietly, not intervening, not guiding, just observing, and his sister glanced at me again, briefly, then looked down at the table, her expression thoughtful instead of dismissive, as if she was rethinking something she had assumed for a long time. Margaret remained standing for a moment longer, before slowly sitting back down, her movements controlled but not as precise as before, like she was adjusting to something she had not prepared for. "This is not how we handle things in this family," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, and the statement sounded less like a rule and more like a reminder of something she believed should still apply. But Daniel did not react the way he used to. He did not nod, he did not agree, he simply looked at her, then back at the table, and that lack of immediate alignment said more than any argument could have. I sat still, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly near my cup, not because I was trying to appear composed, but because I was composed. The tension that had once belonged to me had moved. It had shifted into the space around me, into the people who were now trying to understand what came next. Daniel reached for the documents again, both sets this time, the ones he had brought and the ones I had placed in front of him, and he aligned them side by side, looking at them carefully, not comparing them in a rushed way, but examining them, as if he was seeing two versions of the same story laid out in front of him. And for the first time, he was actually reading both, not just the one he had prepared. "You structured this through a separate entity," he said after a moment, more to himself than to me, and I nodded once. "Yes," I replied, keeping it simple, because the details were already there, written clearly. He flipped a page, then another, slower now, more deliberate. "And the ownership is entirely yours," he continued, and again I nodded. "Yes." And each confirmation seemed to settle deeper than the last, because it was not just information, it was correction. It was replacing assumption with fact. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes moving over the documents again, but she did not speak right away. She was reading now, actually reading, not searching for a way to dismiss it, but trying to understand how this had happened without her knowing. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked the first moment she was no longer controlling the narrative. She was trying to catch up to it. Daniel set the papers down carefully, aligning them again, then rested his hands on either side, his posture steady. "Then the terms we prepared do not apply the way we thought," he said, and this time, it was not a question, it was a conclusion, and that conclusion carried weight, because it acknowledged that the plan he had entered the room with was no longer valid. I did not respond immediately. I simply let the statement exist, because it did not need reinforcement, it needed recognition. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze still on the documents. "We can adjust the terms," she said, her voice quieter now, more measured. But there was something else in it, something that had not been there before. Not control, not authority, but negotiation, and that was a shift she could not ignore. Daniel looked at her, then back at me, and I could see it, the realization forming more clearly now. This was no longer something he could delegate, no longer something he could let his mother handle. This was his decision, his responsibility, and he was beginning to understand that. "We will not adjust anything until everything is reviewed," he said, and the way he said it made it clear. This was not a suggestion, it was a boundary. Margaret's lips pressed together slightly, but she did not interrupt, she did not challenge him directly, because even she could feel it. The dynamic had shifted too far to simply be pulled back. I reached for my cup again, taking a small sip, the liquid now lukewarm, but I did not react to it, because that detail did not matter. What mattered was the quiet steadiness that had replaced the earlier tension. Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to show the weight he had been carrying was beginning to redistribute. Not gone, but no longer resting entirely on the same assumptions. "We will set up a meeting," he said after a moment, looking at me directly now, with both attorneys, and go through everything properly, and I nodded once. "That works," I replied, and the simplicity of the exchange stood in contrast to everything that had led up to it, because it was no longer about confrontation, it was about process. Margaret sat back in her chair, her arms no longer crossed, her posture more neutral, and that alone showed how much had changed, because neutrality had not existed at the beginning of this morning, only control and expectation. The rest of the family remained quiet, but their silence was different now, not passive, not complicit, but observant, aware that something significant had shifted in a way that could not be undone by a single conversation. Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall briefly, then back at the table, as if measuring the moment, not in time, but in meaning. And then he did something small, but important. He reached forward and gently moved my envelope closer to me, not pushing it away, not rejecting it, but acknowledging it as mine, as something that had changed the course of this entire situation. And that gesture, quiet as it was, carried more respect than anything he had said so far. I picked it up and placed it back into my bag, my movements calm, deliberate, and as I did, I realized something that had not been fully clear until now. This was no longer about proving anything. Not to them, not to him, not even to myself. It was about standing in a position where I no longer needed to be proven wrong in order to be seen as right, and that shift, internal as it was the real turning point, because everything that followed from this moment would no longer be shaped by what they assumed about me. It would be shaped by what I had already established, quietly, steadily, long before this morning ever began. No one rushed to stand up after that. Even though the conversation had clearly reached a point where it could have ended, the table remained full, the chairs still occupied, as if everyone understood that something more subtle was still unfolding, something not written in documents or spoken out loud, but present in the way people now looked at each other. Daniel stayed seated, his hands no longer on the papers, but resting loosely on the table, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just still. And that stillness felt different from before. It was not uncertainty anymore, it was processing. Margaret remained quiet as well, which in itself was unusual, her presence no longer directing the room, no longer shaping the flow of conversation. Instead, she sat back slightly, her eyes moving between Daniel and me, not with authority, but with calculation, as if she was trying to understand how the position she had held so firmly had shifted without her noticing. I adjusted slightly in my seat, not out of discomfort, but because the energy in the room had changed enough that even small movements felt more noticeable now. Daniel's father leaned forward a little, resting his elbows lightly on the table, his voice calm when he finally spoke again. "This should have been handled differently from the beginning," he said, not looking at anyone in particular, but the weight of his words settled across the table, because they were not directed, they were reflective, and reflection carries a different kind of authority, one that does not demand agreement but invites recognition. Daniel nodded once, slowly, not as a reaction, but as an acknowledgement, and that simple movement held more honesty than anything he had said earlier, because it was not about defending a position, it was about seeing it clearly. Margaret exhaled softly, her gaze lowering for a brief moment before returning to the table, and for the first time, she did not immediately respond, she did not challenge, she did not redirect, she simply allowed the statement to exist, and that silence from her was more telling than any argument could have been. I remained quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that this moment was not about adding more words, it was about letting what had already been said settle into something real, something that could not be undone by explanation or justification. Daniel glanced at me again. But this time, there was no tension in it, no expectation, just a kind of steady awareness, like he was finally seeing the full picture, instead of reacting to fragments of it. "I did not think it would get to this point," he said, his voice low, measured. And I listened, not interrupting, because what he was saying now was not directed at me in the same way as before. It was directed at the situation itself. "I thought it would be simpler," he added, and there was something in that word, simpler, that revealed more than he might have intended, because simplicity had been based on assumption, and assumption had been the foundation of everything that brought us here. I nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that the word itself made sense in the context he had been operating in. "It was simple," I said calmly, "until it was not." And that line settled into the space between us, not as a challenge, but as a quiet truth. Margaret shifted in her seat again, her hands now resting on the table instead of folded across her chest, her posture less closed, less defensive, but not open either, something in between, something that suggested she was no longer certain how to position herself in this new dynamic. Daniel's sister leaned back slightly, her arms resting loosely at her sides, her gaze moving between the three of us, and there was something different in her expression now. Not judgment, not dismissal, but curiosity, as if she was seeing a version of the situation she had not considered before. Daniel's father spoke again, his tone unchanged, steady. "If this is going to be resolved, then it should be done with full understanding from both sides," he said, and that statement, simple as it was, reinforced what had already begun to take shape, not as a rule, but as a direction. And Daniel nodded again, more firmly this time. "It will be," he said, and the certainty in his voice was different from earlier, not based on control, but based on acceptance of the process itself. I watched him for a moment, taking in the shift, not just in his words, but in his posture, his tone, the way he was now engaging with the situation, And I realized something quietly, something that had not been obvious before. This was not just a shift in outcome, it was a shift in awareness, and awareness changes how everything unfolds. Margaret finally spoke again, but her voice was softer now, less assertive, more measured. "We will review everything," she said, echoing what had already been decided, but in a tone that suggested she was no longer directing it, she was aligning with it, and that alignment, even if reluctant, marked the final step in the transition that had taken place. Daniel glanced at the clock again, then back at the table, and slowly, he pushed his chair back just slightly, not standing, just creating space, like he was preparing to move forward from this moment. "We will contact the attorneys this week," he said, looking at me briefly, then back at the table, and I nodded once. "That is fine," I replied, keeping it simple because at this point, there was nothing left to negotiate in this room. The rest would happen elsewhere, in a different setting, under different conditions, and that was exactly how it should be. The room began to shift subtly after that. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually, chairs moved slightly, people adjusted, the weight of the moment easing just enough to allow normal movement to return. But it was not the same normal as before. Something had changed too deeply for that. I picked up my bag and placed it gently over my shoulder, my movements unhurried, deliberate, and as I stood, I felt a quiet steadiness that had not been there when I first walked into the room that morning. Not because the situation had resolved, but because I had. I looked around the table briefly, not searching for reactions, not expecting anything, just acknowledging the space where everything had shifted, and then I turned slightly toward the door, ready to step out of that moment, not as someone who had been pushed out, but as someone who had chosen how to leave. In the weeks that followed, everything became quieter. Not in the way silence used to feel heavy or uncertain, but in a way that finally felt clear, like the noise had settled and what remained was real. Daniel and I did go through the process we agreed on, with attorneys, with full transparency, every document reviewed, every assumption replaced with fact, and somewhere along the way, it became obvious that what we had built together was not strong enough to continue, not because of that morning, but because of everything that came before it. The distance, the lack of attention, the quiet decisions made without each other. And when the divorce was finalized, it did not feel like something had been taken from me. It felt like something had been returned. My space, my voice, my ability to stand without being overlooked. I moved into a smaller place, not far from where I used to live. Something simple, something that felt entirely mine. And for the first time in a long time, I noticed things I had stopped paying attention to. The way the light came through the windows in the morning, the sound of my own footsteps without tension following behind them, the quiet moments that no longer felt like something I needed to fill or fix, and it was not perfect. Healing never is. There were days when I questioned everything, when I replayed conversations in my head, when I wondered how long things had been broken without me seeing it. But those moments passed, not because I forced them to, but because I finally allowed myself to see them for what they were, part of understanding, not something to be afraid of. I learned something through all of this, something I wish I had understood earlier, that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is where you lose yourself without realizing it, and clarity does not always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from stepping back and seeing what has been there all along. I also learned that protecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary, emotionally, financially, mentally, because the truth is, no one else is responsible for safeguarding your sense of self. That responsibility belongs to you, and it is not something you can afford to ignore. If you are listening to this and something inside you feels familiar, that quiet feeling that something is not right, even if you cannot explain it, do not dismiss it. Do not convince yourself that it is nothing, because more often than not, that is your intuition trying to guide you towards something you have not fully seen yet. Trust it, not blindly, not fearfully, but with awareness. Ask questions, pay attention, and most importantly, do not wait until you are forced into a moment where you have to defend your worth in front of others. You deserve to know your value long before anyone else tries to define it for you. And if you are in a place where you feel overlooked, unheard, or underestimated, I want you to understand something clearly. Your strength does not come from proving others wrong. It comes from knowing who you are without needing their validation. That is where real stability begins, not in control, not in perfection, but in self-awareness. There is also something else I came to believe through all of this, something I cannot fully explain, but I felt it in the quiet moments after everything changed, that there is a kind of guidance, whether you call it intuition, faith, or something greater, that nudges you when you are out of alignment with your own truth. And if you are willing to listen, really listen, it will lead you back to yourself, not instantly, not easily, but steadily, and that is enough. I am not the same person who sat at that table that morning, not because I became stronger in a dramatic way, but because I became more aware, more grounded, more unwilling to ignore what matters, and that has changed everything, not just in what I choose, but in how I see myself. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for allowing this moment to exist beyond just my experience, because if it reached you in any way, then it was not just mine to carry. It became something shared, something understood, and that matters more than anything else. If you feel comfortable, you can share where you are watching from, or what part of this stayed with you the most, and if you want to hear more stories like this, you can stay connected, but only if it feels right to you. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the one thing I hope you take with you from this is simple: do not let anyone decide your worth before you do.